Hello, my dear friends. They washed their faces with poison, slept on rotting straw, and called it elegance. Beneath velvet gowns and painted smiles, the women of the Renaissance carried secrets that reeked of perfume and decay. Beauty was not about purity, but the art of hiding filth. Each ritual, strange, intimate, and deadly, reveals how far they went to appear divine while slowly destroying themselves. Tonight, you'll step inside their world, where every breath of sweetness carries the scent of death. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to open a chest in a Renaissance woman's bedroom, the first thing to notice would not be silk or lace, but a single, tired piece of linen folded neatly at the top. This was her undergarment, worn not for luxury or comfort, but for modesty and necessity. Made of coarse fabric that scraped the skin when new and stiffened with use, it was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. The cloth clung to the body until it learned its shape, absorbing sweat and oil, darkening with every passing day. For most women, it would not be changed for a week, sometimes longer. Water was scarce, soap was expensive, and washing was an ordeal that few had time or means to perform. Instead, they found ways to disguise the smell and the stains, turning neglect into habit and habit into custom. Small sachets of crushed herbs or flowers were sprinkled inside the fabric folds, leaving a faint fragrance that clung to the body. These scents, often lavender, rosemary, or sage, were considered symbols of purity, though they did little more than mask the odour of decay. The linen itself was rarely scrubbed. Instead, it was aired in the sunlight before being worn again. Some believed that too much washing weakened the fibres and the flesh beneath, an idea that made dirt seem like a form of protection. It is almost amusing to imagine that they thought unwashed fabric could shield their bodies from harm, when in truth it trapped every trace of it. The texture of the garments told their own story. The inner seams grew stiff with dried sweat, and the edges frayed where the thighs rubbed together during long hours of work. Every movement reminded them of the roughness beneath their skirts. The itch became familiar, a small price for propriety. For richer women, the problem was less visible but no less real. Fine linen and embroidery hid the same neglect beneath layers of silk gowns and perfumes. The body remained unseen, but not untouched by its own residue. Servants who dressed their mistresses learned to hold their breath, and laundresses worked with gloves when they finally dared to clean these intimate pieces. In the lower quarters of cities, where washing lines drooped between narrow alleys, it was common to see undergarments hung out only once a week. The water fetched from wells or streams was often brown, filled with silt, and sometimes shared with animals. Soap was made from animal fat and ashes, its harshness leaving the skin raw. It is little wonder women avoided it whenever they could. Rubbing coarse fabric on tender skin left marks that stung for days. Many simply brushed the garments off and put them back on, convincing themselves that air and herbs were enough. If one were to compare this to today, it would be like someone wearing the same synthetic underwear for days, spraying perfume on top, and believing it counted as hygiene. The air of Renaissance homes carried layers of scent smoke from hearths, oils from cooking, sweat from labour, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs. Together, they created an odour that everyone accepted. No one questioned the smell of another, because it was the smell of everyone. Bathing habits were irregular, and even the wealthy considered frequent washing unnecessary or dangerous. Doctors warned that water opened the pores, allowing illness to enter. A clean body, paradoxically, was thought to be more vulnerable than a dirty one. That belief turned hygiene into superstition, and superstition into routine. The undergarments themselves reflected this philosophy. Worn until visible stains appeared, they were considered used up only when the fabric could no longer hold its shape. At that point, they were boiled in lye water or cut into smaller pieces to be used as rags. Few women owned more than 1 or 2 pairs, and these were treated as private possessions, never mentioned in polite conversation. Mothers taught their daughters how to fold them discreetly, how to hide the stains with careful layering, and how to apply herbs or powders that could make them seem cleaner than they were. Cleanliness was measured not by freshness but by concealment. Among noble women, perfumed sachets were pinned directly onto the undergarments. The sweet smell was thought to signal refinement, but the reality beneath the scent was rarely questioned. Embroidered initials decorated the fabric edges, though they did little to disguise the stiff patches where skin met cloth for too long. The maids who handled these items learned to work quickly, holding the garments at arm's length. In the grand households, even filth had a hierarchy. The mistress's stains were perfumed, the servants were left to dry. I can almost picture the irony of it, how elegance in public was stitched together by weeks of unwashed linen in private. For those living near rivers, some attempted washing, though the results were uncertain. The water was cold and filled with waste, turning the act of cleaning into one of contamination. The garments hung stiff in the wind, white for a moment, before the grey returned. Women rubbed the fabric against stones, scouring away what little remained of softness. Their hands cracked from the cold, and the cloth hardened again by evening. Each week repeated the same ritual of effort and surrender, until the fabric itself became thin and transparent from wear. The custom of long use without washing was rarely questioned. To wash too often was wasteful, to wash too little was ordinary. Between these two beliefs, filth found comfort. The skin beneath these garments often bore rashes, boils, or raw patches, but these were treated with oils or powders instead of water. A woman's health was considered her responsibility, yet she was given few tools to maintain it. In a world where appearance mattered more than comfort, even suffering was made to look graceful. The undergarments may have been hidden, but their effects were written across the skin of every woman who wore them. The persistence of these habits tells us much about the priorities of the time. Modesty was valued above hygiene, and endurance was mistaken for virtue. The garments were proof of discipline, of a woman's ability to tolerate discomfort without complaint. The faint fragrance of herbs gave an illusion of care, a gesture of respectability that covered decay. Beneath the perfume and propriety, the body simply endured. The idea of changing undergarments daily would have seemed absurd then, as unnecessary as bathing in the middle of winter. Cleanliness was a matter of perception, not practice. What mattered most was that no one saw, no one asked, and no one spoke. The silence was as thick as the fabric itself, holding the truth close to the skin until it became part of life. The undergarment was not just clothing, it was a symbol of compromise between comfort and custom. It was the first layer put on and the last to be removed, a secret no woman could escape. Its coarse touch lingered through days of labour and nights of rest, leaving behind marks invisible to others but known deeply by those who wore it. The weekly ritual of wearing, perfuming, and pretending to find the rhythm of feminine life in the Renaissance. It was not ignorance that kept them from washing, it was the structure of their world, where purity was judged by faith and appearances, not by the smell of linen. The truth hides easily in fabric, and so it did for centuries. What seemed like order was merely endurance wrapped in cloth. What smelled of herbs was only the scent of acceptance. The unwashed garment was more than dirt. It was a quiet confession of a society that prized reputation over reality. It was a comfort to believe that fragrance meant purity, and that habit meant virtue. But the fabric never forgot. The week would pass, the scent would fade, and the cycle would begin again. The linen told the story even when the women did not. The stains grew darker, but no one noticed. Perhaps they would notice something else instead. They did not bathe in clean water. What filled the wooden tubs of Renaissance homes was not a luxury but a shared necessity. The same basin might serve a mother, her daughters, and her sisters in one evening, the water growing cloudier with every turn. The surface glistened with floating bits of leaves and skin, while the bottom collected a thin layer of pale residue. It was a ritual that felt more symbolic than cleansing. They believed the herbs steeped within could purify the skin and strengthen the spirit. Yet by the time the last woman stepped into the tub, the liquid had turned tepid and sour. The smell of wilted leaves mixed with sweat hung thick in the air, but no one questioned it. To bathe, even in reused water, was still better than not bathing at all. The leaves floating on top were thought to carry healing power. Rosemary for strength, thyme for purity, mint for clarity, and sage for protection. But these herbs were rarely replaced. Once used, they were left to dry in the corners of the room, then steeped again until their colour faded to brown. The mixture became dense and heavy, its scent more like damp soil than freshness. It is darkly humorous to think they believed this stagnant mixture was medicine for the body, while it was, in truth, closer to a mild poison of its own. The warmth of the water, when there was any, came from boiled pots carried in from the hearth. Most households did not have enough wood to keep the water hot, so by the end of the bath, it was cold, thick, and coated with oil from many skins. Those who bathed first felt privileged. They dipped their hands gently into the herbal water and sighed as if absorbing health through the pores. But as each person finished, the water turned murkier. By the time the last among them entered, it was no longer water but a grey soup of sweat, soap residue, and herb fragments. They stepped in with resignation, closing their eyes to avoid looking at the floating remnants. The act of bathing was more about maintaining the idea of cleanliness than achieving it. If one were to compare this to today, it would be like several people sharing the same bath water filled with dissolved body wash and believing the foam still had cleansing power. The tubs themselves were shallow and roughly made, their wooden staves leaking slightly at the seams. When placed indoors, they left wet marks on the floorboards. A small candle flickered beside the tub, its smoke mingling with the damp scent. The women's long skirts were tucked above the knees, exposing pale skin that bore faint marks of fabric and dirt. They rubbed their arms gently, avoiding harsh movements that might release more filth into the water. The task was performed in silence, with a steady rhythm of scooping and pouring, each splash dull and muffled. The air cooled quickly, and the warmth of the bath faded faster than their illusions of purity. When the bath ended, they did not rinse. The herbal residue was left to dry naturally on the skin, forming a thin film that felt tight and sticky. This, they believed, was the essence of the herbs sinking into the flesh, sealing in health and virtue. The scent lingered for days, clinging to clothing, bedding, and hair. For them, the faint odour of mildew was proof of good care, not neglect. I find it quietly disturbing that a smell we now associate with rot once signified health. Servants carried the used water outside, pouring it near gardens or behind stables. The patches of ground where it soaked became dark and soft, feeding weeds more than flowers. The buckets were rarely scrubbed before being refilled, and so each new bath began with traces of the last. In some homes, especially in towns where space was scarce, the same water was reheated the next day. What had started as an herbal infusion became a stew of old oils and decaying leaves. No one spoke of this openly. It was simply understood. For those with means, the ritual was more elaborate but no cleaner. Large copper tubs lined with linen stood in the middle of chambers, surrounded by scented candles. Yet even there, the water was reused by several family members. Maids refilled the top with fresh herbs to hide the state beneath. The steam rising from the tub carried a sweet, earthy smell that masked the truth. A noble woman stepping in might have felt refined, but beneath the surface floated the same mix of dirt and perfume that marked every other household. The water was seen not as a medium for cleaning, but as a vessel of transference. Whatever good the herbs possessed was thought to pass from one person to another through the liquid. The idea of contamination did not exist. To share bath water with family was to share their vitality, a symbolic communion of body and spirit. The logic seemed sound enough in a world that prized togetherness over hygiene, but what truly passed between them were the invisible traces of illness, bacteria, and skin disease that found comfort in the lukewarm water. Some healers recommended adding wine or vinegar to the mixture, claiming it strengthened the effect. The sharp scent might have covered the staleness for a while, but it also irritated the skin, leaving red patches that women mistook for renewed blood flow. They called it awakening of the skin, though it was closer to inflammation. To them, the pain meant the herbs were working. The greater the sting, the stronger the cure. Bathing, in this sense, was more performance than hygiene. It was done occasionally, sometimes weekly, often monthly, depending on water, weather, and will. The illusion of cleanliness mattered more than the result. Afterward, they dried their bodies with cloths that were seldom washed, rubbed oil on the skin to soften it, and dressed again in garments that carried the scent of the last bath. In the dim light of Renaissance homes, such rituals seemed beautiful. Only under daylight would one see the film of dirt still clinging to the flesh. The act of bathing together bound families and reaffirmed their customs. It was not ignorance alone, but the weight of belief that kept them from change. Cleanliness was measured in effort, not in purity. The more elaborate the ritual, the more virtuous it seemed, regardless of outcome. Water might have been foul, but intention was everything. The truth of those baths lies not in the herbs they used, but in the faith they placed in them. The baths were both comfort and confinement, a way to feel safe while living in filth. It was proof that illusion could be stronger than reality, and that scent could convince people they were pure. They shared the same water, the same faith, and the same mistake. They left the tubs believing the body renewed. Perhaps they didn't notice what else stayed on their skin. They believed that clear liquids must be clean, and so they turned to what seemed pure. Instead of water, they reached for bottles of wine, old spirits, or the dregs of perfume left forgotten on their shelves. The scent rising from these bottles was sharp and sour, a mix of alcohol and decay. But to them it carried refinement. They dipped rough cloths into the cloudy liquid and rubbed them across their skin, calling it cleansing. The sting that followed was proof of effectiveness. The redness that bloomed across the arms and neck felt like renewal, though it was only irritation. They did not wash to remove dirt, they washed to feel civilized. The rags they used were seldom clean. Torn pieces of linen or worn sleeves became their washing tools, soaked until dripping, then pressed over the body. The mixture of alcohol and residue left a sticky sheen that dried in uneven patches. Dust still clung to the skin, but the lingering scent of wine or perfume gave the illusion of freshness. It is strange to think that for them, smelling faintly of spoiled perfume counted as cleanliness, while the skin beneath still carried days of sweat. When perfume bottles ran low, they were never thrown away. Women added water or cheap spirits to stretch the last drops, shaking the mixture until a cloudy layer formed at the bottom. The thick residue was considered precious. It was rubbed onto wrists, necks, and even under the arms, believed to shield the body from bad air. The more oily the texture, the better the protection was thought to be. Over time, these layers hardened into a dull glaze. Under candlelight, the skin shone faintly, not from health, but from residue that sealed in every trace of dirt. In many homes, this ritual replaced bathing entirely. A full wash was rare and reserved for special occasions, but a daily wipe with alcohol or perfume was manageable. Bottles of cheap spirits were easy to find. Distillers sold them by the jar, and perfumers offered rejected mixtures at a lower price. The ingredients were unknown, often mixed with turpentine or vinegar, but the sharp burn was mistaken for purity. When the cloth touched the skin, it left a cool sensation followed by dryness that they took as proof of cleanliness. In truth, the surface might have been wiped, but the pores remained clogged with sweat and powder. The smell of a Renaissance street revealed this quiet ritual, air thick with wine, smoke, and flowers that had long lost their sweetness. Each passerby carried a different blend, one reeking of lavender turned sour, another of rose dulled by vinegar. Together, they created a fragrance that hovered between elegance and decay. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like people spraying themselves with expired cologne mixed with disinfectant and calling it a beauty routine. Those who could afford imported perfume treated it as a sign of sophistication. The bottles were small, made of coloured glass with wax seals, and displayed proudly on dressing tables. But even these perfumes, heavy with oil and natural extracts, spoiled quickly in the heat. The scent turned metallic, and the texture thickened. Yet no one dared to discard them. Waste was a greater sin than filth. The spoiled perfume became a kind of treasure, used slowly until it congealed into a paste. They believed its potency increased with time, as if aging transformed rot into luxury. The practice spread across social classes. In poorer homes, spirits replaced perfume entirely. Mothers soaked rags in wine and wiped the faces of their children, believing it would ward off sickness. The sting made the children cry, but they were told the pain meant health. The leftover liquid was poured into basins to wipe furniture and floors, making the entire house smell faintly of sour grapes. Cleanliness, in this sense, was a performance for the nose rather than the eyes. Doctors of the time wrote approvingly about the method. They warned that water softened the flesh and opened the body to disease, but alcohol, they said, closed it. This belief gave scientific weight to what was simply convenience. To wipe with wine was quicker than boiling water or preparing a bath. It also allowed people to appear refined without effort. The faint perfume masked both poverty and neglect. To smell sweet was to seem respectable, and that illusion mattered more than health. The clothes used in this ritual were rarely laundered. They hung beside mirrors, drying stiff with residue. Each morning, they were re-wet and reused, spreading yesterday's filth into today's act of purity. The skin beneath grew dry, cracked, and sometimes infected, but the shine of perfume hid the damage. The woman powdered over the redness, calling it bloom. The cycle of concealment continued, each layer covering the last until the body itself seemed forgotten beneath it all. Within the walls of wealthier homes, the process was gentler but equally misguided. Servants warmed bowls of scented alcohol and brought them to their mistresses, who sat on cushioned stools while the liquid was applied with soft cloths. The servants' hands burned from repeated contact, their own skin peeling from the harshness. But the mistresses smiled, surrounded by fragrance, believing themselves pure. The scent filled the room, and for a moment it felt like grace. It is unsettling how easily ritual replaced reason. They valued the feeling of being clean over the act itself, trusting in smell more than sight. To wash with perfume was to borrow virtue from scent. It turned cleanliness into theatre, something performed rather than lived. I cannot help but feel that their world was built on such illusions, where decay was disguised as delicacy, and the senses were deceived until they forgot the truth. What they left behind were bottles half filled with cloudy liquids, rags stiff with residue, and skins that glowed faintly under the weight of false purity. They believed they were protecting themselves from disease, unaware they were sealing the very filth they feared beneath layers of scent. They wiped their bodies until the cloths grew dark. They breathed in the sweetness that masked decay. Perhaps they never noticed how the scent of wine always lingered longer than the illusion it carried. They looked down at their hands and saw pride where others might have seen dirt. To them, the colour beneath the nails spoke not of labour, but of learning. A fine layer of dust, ink, and soot gathered with time, proof that the hands had touched parchment and books rather than soil. Clean nails were for servants and peasants, those who worked under the sun and scrubbed their fingers raw. The noble and the educated let their hair grow long, curved, and darkened at the edges. The stain was not shameful, it was a symbol, an unspoken mark of distance from toil. Women in particular guarded their nails as ornaments of refinement. They soaked their fingers in scented oils, not to clean them, but to soften the skin around them so the nails could lengthen undisturbed. The tips became brittle, catching the light in strange ways, yet breaking one was considered tragic. They would rather hide the hand than trim it. Some even rubbed charcoal dust into the nail beds to deepen the shade, a deliberate display of sophistication. It is almost comical that what we would call filth today was once paraded as a token of culture and grace. In parlours and drawing rooms, pale fingers adorned with dark nails rested upon embroidered sleeves. When they gestured, the contrast was striking white lace, ivory skin, and a crescent of black beneath each fingertip. Those marks came from ink, spices, or the smoke of candles that clung to the body. The scent of oil, ash, and perfume mixed into something uniquely human and faintly unpleasant. Yet to them it was the perfume of intellect. To cut the nails was to erase that identity, to strip away evidence of refinement. Among men, the custom took on a scholarly tone. Long nails implied hours spent writing or reading by lamplight. They were evidence of a life untouched by labour, the privilege of thought over sweat. Some scholars boasted of nails so long they left marks on the paper as they wrote. They saw these smudges as their signature, an accidental flourish born of wisdom. When the ink stained their fingertips, they simply wiped them on cloth or the hems of their sleeves. The stains became part of their uniform in crowded homes, where food was eaten by hand. The nails trapped the scent of every meal. Grease, herbs, and smoke settled beneath the edges, clinging for days. Instead of washing, they masked the odour by pressing small scraps of perfumed cloth into the hollow space between the nail and the skin. This habit was common among noble women, who believed that fragrance signalled purity. The cloth darkened and crumbled with time, replaced only when it fell out. What began as a mark of delicacy became a small pocket of rot. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like people stuffing fabric softener sheets under their fingernails to hide the smell of spoiled food. The nails themselves grew thick and uneven from neglect. Without trimming, they developed ridges and cracks that caught dirt easily. When the weather turned cold, the tips turned pale blue from poor circulation, and rings of soot formed around the cuticles. Yet in portraits, these hands were painted with care, resting lightly upon books or fans, symbols of quiet dignity. Artists softened the details, turning the blackened crescents into gentle shadows, preserving the illusion of beauty. Servants who tended to their master's hands often found the task unpleasant. To file or polish such nails meant scraping through layers of grime. They worked silently, careful not to offend, while the air filled with the smell of perfume and decay. In wealthier homes, servants wore gloves for this task, not to protect the nails they cleaned, but to protect their own skin. The irony was not lost on them. They scrubbed the filth of those who never touched soil, yet their own hands were the cleanest of the two. Physicians of the time wrote little about the health of nails, except to note that discoloration showed an excess of bile or heat in the blood. Rather than recommending cleanliness, they prescribed perfumes or ointments to cover the appearance. The idea of washing hands thoroughly was almost foreign. Water was for the face, sometimes the neck, rarely for the nails. Many believed washing too often weakened the mind. If intellect was sacred, then the dirt it left behind was sacred too. Even gatherings carried traces of this belief. At banquets, when fingers dipped into shared dishes, no one recoiled at the sight of grime beneath the nails. To question another's cleanliness was to insult their status. People accepted the mingling of food and residue as part of the meal. The smell of roasted meat, wax, and human touch blended into one indistinct aroma that filled the halls. The elegance of the feast was meant to disguise the nature of the hands that served it. Some women painted their nails with herbal mixtures to strengthen them. The ingredients often included ash, vinegar, or powdered lead. These concoctions added colour but corroded the surface over time, leaving streaks of grey. When the nails cracked, they wrapped them in thin strips of cloth and continued as before, unwilling to surrender their symbol of refinement. The appearance of effortlessness mattered more than the effort to stay clean. I find something quietly tragic in that, the way beauty was measured by distance from labour, even if it meant living with decay. The blackened nails became a metaphor for the age itself. Behind every polished exterior lay a layer of neglect. The Renaissance celebrated art, intellect, and elegance, yet beneath it all was a comfort with filth that clung to every surface. They admired their hands not because they were clean, but because they were untouched by necessity. To work was to fall from grace. To let dirt settle was to prove one's superiority. The sight of such hands tells a story of contradiction. They sought refinement, but carried corruption at their fingertips. The stains beneath the nails were not accidents, but statements, quiet affirmations that purity was never meant for everyone. They lifted their hands with pride, believing the darkness there meant enlightenment. They hid decay beneath fragrance and polish. In the silence of their halls, one could almost mistake the stench of neglect for the scent of nobility. They believed a white smile was a sign of virtue. To achieve it, they turned to the most common powder in their homes, the grey dust left behind after a fire. Ash from the hearth, mixed with coarse salt and a splash of vinegar, became their morning ritual. They scooped the mixture with their fingers, pressing it onto their teeth and rubbing until their gums bled. The taste was bitter and metallic, the texture gritty, but they called it purity. The sting on their tongues felt like progress, the pain like proof that beauty required endurance. Clean water was scarce, brushes were unknown, and yet every household had ashes. Fire was constant, and from its remains they created what they believed to be cleanliness. Women gathered small bowls of this mixture on their dressing tables, sometimes decorated with dried flowers to make the practice appear elegant. The vinegar gave a sharp scent that filled the air, while the salt crystals scraped at the enamel. The first touch burned slightly, but as the mouth numbed, they continued until the paste turned dark from blood and residue. They rinsed with wine or nothing at all, spitting into the fire so that the flames might purify what was expelled. The logic was circular, but comforting. What came from fire should return to it. It is almost absurd that they used the ashes of burnt wood to achieve brightness, thinking destruction could somehow create beauty. The custom spread quickly among both the poor and the wealthy. For those with little, the ingredients were free and abundant. For the wealthy, the method carried the charm of simplicity, a connection to rustic virtue wrapped in refinement. Servants prepared the mixture each morning, stirring ashes into vinegar until it hissed softly. The bowl was passed from one person to another, each dipping their finger into the same grey sludge. To share it was to share a family ritual, even if it carried invisible harm. The salt wore away at the enamel, the vinegar eroded what remained, and soon the once white teeth dulled into yellow shards. Yet this damage was slow, almost invisible day by day, hidden beneath polite smiles and powdered faces. In paintings and portraits, the smiles were always closed. Artists knew better than to show what lay behind the lips. The ideal of beauty remained intact because it existed only in theory. In reality, teeth darkened with decay, gums receded, and mouths carried a sour scent of vinegar and ash. But to admit this would have broken the illusion of grace. Instead, women chewed herbs or cloves to mask the taste, holding the spice between their teeth until their mouths burned. Cleanliness, as ever, was measured by scent, not health. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like people scrubbing their teeth with powdered charcoal and bleach, mistaking the burning for proof that it works. Some even swallowed the mixture intentionally. They believed that ash cleansed the body from within, that swallowing a small amount of burnt matter could clear the eyes and purify the stomach. The thought was strange but persistent. They connected the white smoke of fire with clarity of vision, convinced that by consuming its remains, they could absorb its purity. A few took pride in their discipline, claiming that those who could bear the taste would live longer. In truth, the mixture burned the throat, upset the stomach, and left a bitter dryness that lingered for hours. But belief is often stronger than discomfort, and the ritual continued. Over time, their mouths grew tender, gums swelled and teeth loosened. Yet they saw these signs not as harm but as cleansing. Blood on the cloth was interpreted as proof that bad humours were leaving the body. Pain meant success. They leaned into the discomfort, praising endurance as virtue. When a tooth fell out, it was seen as a sacrifice to beauty, a price willingly paid for purity. I can almost feel a strange sadness in it, how they confused destruction for refinement, turning pain into a symbol of grace. Merchants seized upon the fashion, selling jars of purified ash at the markets. The packaging bore drawings of radiant smiles and poetic inscriptions about the fire's purity. In reality, it was no different from what lay in every hearth, only repackaged and perfumed with a trace of rosemary or clove. The illusion of improvement was enough to justify the price. Buyers felt comforted by the scent, by the promise written on the label, by the idea that something purchased must surely be better than what they could make themselves. In noble households, this ritual became part of the morning routine, alongside dressing and prayer. Ladies sat before mirrors, dabbing grey paste on their teeth with a folded cloth, then pressing a perfumed rag to their lips to cover the smell. The servant stood nearby, holding silver cups for rinsing, pretending not to notice the grey streaks left behind on the fabric, the air filled with the sharp smell of vinegar and faint smoke, mingling with the scent of powder and perfume. Beauty was achieved through discipline, and discipline was worth pain. By late adulthood, few had teeth left to polish. Smiles grew cautious, laughter restrained, meals were soft, soups, and porridges that required no chewing. Yet even then, the habit endured. Some continued to rub their gums with ash, believing it kept their breath pure for prayer. The ritual had outlived its logic, surviving through habit and pride. The grey dust of the hearth had become a symbol of care, an inheritance passed from mothers to daughters. The history of their smiles reveals more than vanity. It shows a faith in visible purity, in effort that could be seen and smelled even if it caused pain. They could not imagine cleanliness without abrasion, or beauty without suffering. What mattered was not the result, but the act itself, repeated until it felt natural. The ashes that blackened their tongues were the same ashes that comforted their minds. They rubbed their teeth until their gums burned raw. They smiled through the sting, convinced it was virtue. In the quiet glow of the fire, no one questioned why purity had to taste like smoke. They believed that the secret to beautiful hair was hidden in the simplest of ingredients. In kitchens that smelled of smoke and damp wood, women whisked together raw eggs and ground corn, creating a thick yellow mixture that clung to the spoon like glue. The bowl was warm to the touch, its surface glossy and alive. They called it nourishment, a treatment passed down through families and praised for its promise to make hair shine. The idea of washing it out seemed foolish to them. The longer the mixture stayed, the deeper they believed its power would sink into the scalp. They rubbed it in slowly, parting their hair with wooden combs, letting the sticky paste slide through their fingers. The sound was soft and wet, a quiet rhythm that filled the small rooms where they worked. Once the mixture covered every strand. They wrapped their heads in cloth and waited. Hours passed. The air grew thick with the faint scent of egg, sharp and sour as it dried. The paste hardened, pulling at the roots until every movement of the head felt like a reminder of patience. When the cloth was finally removed, the hair stood stiff and dull at first, then softened with the warmth of their hands. They saw the result and called it success. It is strange to think that what began as a breakfast ingredient became a beauty secret, as though nourishment could travel backward from food to flesh. The scalp beneath, however, did not always agree. The mixture trapped heat, and sweat gathered underneath, mixing with egg and oil. When they scratched their heads, flakes of dried corn fell like dust onto their shoulders, yet they were convinced the discomfort meant the treatment was working. The tighter the scalp felt, the healthier the hair must be. They called this tension firmness of the roots, believing that pain ensured strength. When the weather turned warm, the mixture fermented, releasing a scent that filled the air around them. To those nearby, it was unpleasant. To them, it was proof that the recipe was alive. For those who could afford perfume, a few drops were added to the mixture to hide the smell. Rosewater, lavender, or even vinegar might be poured in, though it only added another layer to the sourness. The scent clung to their pillows, to their combs, to the rooms where they slept. Servants complained of the lingering odour, but they were ignored. The fragrance of success, however strange, was not to be questioned. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like coating hair with raw dough and perfume, then mistaking the rising smell of fermentation for beauty. The process was slow and methodical, a ritual rather than a necessity. Women sat before mirrors with patience, smoothing the thick paste through their hair as if tending to something sacred. The texture changed under their touch, from slick to grainy, from soft to brittle. They watched as the mixture dried into pale streaks along the strands, giving a faint shimmer in the candlelight. When it was finally set, they combed through it gently, shaking loose crumbs of corn that fell like pale snow onto the floor. Each piece that broke away revealed a little more of the hair beneath, oily, stiff, and faintly yellowed, but shining enough to satisfy the eye. In wealthier homes, maids performed the treatment for their mistresses. They stood behind them, carefully applying the paste while trying not to breathe too deeply. The scent of eggs was heavy and sweet, layered with the faint musk of perfume. When the mixture dried, it cracked slightly, leaving a fine powder on the shoulders of the noblewomen who wore it like invisible dust. Still, they walked with confidence, convinced that the smell of fermentation was the scent of care. The hair itself suffered under this devotion. The scalp became tender and inflamed from repeated use, and strands broke from dryness where the mixture hardened too much. But the women did not stop. They believed that beauty demanded endurance, that all discomfort was temporary and worthwhile. They combed, scraped, and reapplied until their hair lay flat and glossy, even as the roots weakened beneath the weight of habit. I find it quietly unsettling that they mistook the signs of decay for proof of beauty, unable to see that the shine they admired came from the residue of rot. For poorer families, the same practice took place with fewer ingredients. Cornmeal replaced fine powder, and water replaced perfume. The result was grittier, heavier, and far more pungent. They dried their hair by sitting near open windows, letting the sun do the work. The heat thickened the air around them, and soon the smell of sour egg filled the street. Children laughed and teased, yet the women smiled. To them, it meant the treatment was effective. Every odour was a signal that the hair had been fed. When the weather was damp, the scent never left. Rain brought it back to life, softening what had hardened days before. The smell followed them everywhere, into churches, markets, and beds. Even their husbands, used to the scent of smoke and sweat, noticed the difference. But still, the ritual continued. It was not vanity alone that sustained it. It was faith in tradition. a quiet obedience to what mothers and grandmothers had promised. Merchants began to sell premixed powders of corn and crushed herbs, promising purity and ease. The jars were labelled with grand claims for shining locks, for noble hair, for eternal strength. Few questioned what was inside. The idea of a miracle in a bowl was easier to believe than the truth of rotting eggs and sour air. They stirred the powder, added eggs, and repeated the cycle. Each application renewed not just their hair, but the illusion that they were preserving their beauty. By night, as they unwrapped their hair, the mixture cracked and fell away like dry plaster. The pillowcases bore stains. The sheets carried the scent of vinegar and decay. They slept through it, dreaming of purity and grace, never suspecting that their comfort had turned to contamination. To wake with the smell of sourness was simply to wake as they always had. They pressed the mixture deeper into their scalps, believing in its magic. They breathed in the sourness and called it sweetness. Somewhere between faith and habit, the line between care and decay disappeared. They collected what the body no longer needed and called it useful. In the corners of their homes stood large clay jars, heavy and damp, filled with what the family had produced over the course of days. The air around them carried a faint, sour tang that grew stronger each morning. They believed this liquid held a kind of strength, that its sharpness could strip away stains no other substance could touch. When a dress was soiled or an apron marked by work, it was not soap they reached for, but the jar. The thought of waste was unthinkable, and so nothing of the body was wasted. Women poured the yellow liquid into basins, their hands steady from practice. They added a handful of ash or salt to thicken it, stirring until the smell spread through the room. Cloth was then lowered into the mixture, pressed, and rubbed until bubbles rose to the surface. The heat of fermentation made the liquid warm, almost alive. It hissed faintly as fabric met the surface, as though something hidden within was waking up. The garments turned lighter in places, the stains fading under the acid touch. They believed it was purification, though the scent of what they called cleanliness lingered long after drying. It is unsettlingly ironic that what should have been discarded became the very thing they trusted to make themselves clean. Families treated this chore as routine. Children fetched the jars, men carried the rinsing water, and women handled the rest. When the jar ran low, they filled it again, waiting for it to sit long enough to ripen. Fresh liquid was too mild. Old liquid, pungent and sharp, worked best. They understood its stages as carefully as a cook understands a recipe. The smell of ammonia rising from the clay was the sign of readiness. Once it burned the nose, they knew it would clean. Clothing steeped for hours, sometimes overnight, before being beaten against stones or rubbed between the hands. The sound echoed through courtyards and backyards, a rhythm of labour that mixed with the cries of animals. The fabrics grew soft and pale again, though the odour clung. To fight it, they hung the garments near the stables, letting the smell of hay and manure disguise the truth. From a distance, the sight looked peaceful, sheets flapping gently beside barns, sunlight shining through them. Up close, the scent told another story entirely. In towns, washerwomen gathered near rivers where the water carried away what they did not wish to keep. They worked elbow-deep in the mixture, splashing and wringing. Their hands cracked and raw from the harshness. The smell clung to their skin long after the work was done. Still, they were proud of their craft. A clean dress was proof of diligence, no matter the method. They laughed as they worked, numb to the odour, blind to the irony. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like people scrubbing their clothes with chemical waste and feeling proud of how bright they look afterward. The wealthy were no strangers to this practice. Their laundresses did it for them, hidden behind stone walls or in basements where the smell could not reach the upper floors. Fine garments of silk and linen were dipped carefully, turned over with wooden sticks so that no hand would directly touch what belonged to the mistress. When the work was done, scented oils were sprinkled over the drying fabric. The result was deceptive. A gown could smell faintly of roses and still carry the memory of the jar. The practice was ancient and efficient, passed down through generations without question. People knew that water alone could not remove oil or blood, but urine could. Its acidity made it powerful, and power was valued more than comfort. They accepted its sting, its smell, and its strange warmth as part of the process. Cleanliness was not about scent, it was about effort. The harder the task, the purer the result. I cannot help but feel that their idea of purity was never about what was real, but what could be endured. After washing, they carried the basins outside, pouring the cloudy remnants onto dirt roads. The liquid darkened the soil and drew flies. In winter, the smell froze into the air, sharp and unmistakable. Travellers passing by knew when laundry day had come simply from the sting in their noses. Yet within those homes, no one found it strange. It was simply life, another rhythm of necessity that no one thought to question. The clothes dried stiff under the sun, their fibres hardened by salt and time. When folded, they creaked faintly, leaving faint streaks on hands that touched them. But they looked clean, and that illusion was enough. To wear them was to wear the scent of labour disguised as virtue. Women pressed the fabric to their faces and inhaled the faint trace of what they believed to be purity. In the great houses, where image meant everything, servants kept smaller jars hidden from sight. They refilled them quietly, replacing lids before guests arrived. The stench that filled the lower corridors never drifted to the grand rooms above. There, silk curtains swayed in the breeze, masking the truth that beneath every polished floor was the smell of what no one wished to name. The ritual of washing in such a way was not born from ignorance alone. It came from survival, from making use of what was available. Soap was expensive, water was limited, and the body provided what was free. In their minds, there was nothing dirty about it. There was only practicality. The jar stood as a quiet symbol of thrift and endurance, something no home could do without. They scrubbed their dresses in the warmth of their own waist. They hung them proudly in the sunlight, believing them pure. Even now, the thought of it lingers, as if the air itself remembers what they called clean. They stood over small clay bowls where smoke curled upward in pale grey ribbons, believing that the rising haze carried purity with it. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt fabric, a smell both sour and sweet, filling the corners of the room until breathing itself felt thick. Old undergarments, worn until the fibres thinned, were torn into strips and tossed into the bowl. As the fire caught, it released the faint crackle of oil and sweat long absorbed into the cloth. They crouched above the smoke, lifting their skirts carefully, letting the vapours wrap around them. It was not pleasure that drove them to this ritual, but faith. The smoke, they said, cleansed what could not be washed. They called it a scent bath, though no water was involved. In their minds, the fire purified everything it touched, and its smoke carried that same sanctity to the body. Women believed that by allowing the smoke to drift beneath their clothing, it would erase the smell of age, of work, of life itself. The skin would carry the faint aroma of the fabric instead, a memory of linen, ashes, and herbs burned together. The line between cleansing and concealment vanished. The fire consumed what was dirty, and the body absorbed what remained. It is oddly tragic that they thought smoke could mask decay when all it did was replace one odour with another. The ingredients varied from home to home. Some burned linen soaked in oil, others mixed dried flowers or spices into the flame to sweeten the air. A few used resin or wine, thinking the scent more refined. Yet all shared the same method, crouched close to the bowl, eyes closed, skirts raised enough for the smoke to reach its destination. The sensation was warm, sometimes uncomfortably so, but they endured it. The heat against the skin felt like proof that the ritual worked. The smell clung for hours afterward, trapped between layers of fabric, sweet at first, then acrid. In dim rooms where light filtered through narrow windows, the smoke drifted lazily upward, curling against walls darkened by soot. The bowl sat on the floor, glowing faintly, as women leaned forward in silence. No words were spoken. The act was private, almost sacred. When finished, they pressed cool cloths to their faces, as though washing away the evidence of what they had done. The ashes were left in the bowl until morning, when they were collected and stored in small jars. These ashes, mixed with oil, became ointments that were rubbed on the skin as perfume or protection. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like people burning their used clothing for fragrance and believing the smoke carried luxury. The practice was not limited to the poor. Even in wealthy homes, women sought this strange form of cleansing. Perfume was costly, and real baths were rare, so the ritual served as a compromise. Servants prepared the bowls, lighting the fabric with trembling hands, then left the room quietly to give privacy. Behind closed doors, the same ritual repeated the smell of burnt linen, the hiss of flame, and the faint sigh of satisfaction as the smoke touched skin. When the mistress emerged, her dress carried a new scent, heavy and dark, and she smiled as if purity itself had returned to her. Medical texts of the time even praised the ritual. Physicians claimed that warm smoke tightened the flesh and protected against disease. Some recommended specific herbs, thyme for strength, sage for purity, and rose petals for modesty. The instructions were careful and poetic, transforming what was essentially fumigation into art. The idea spread quickly. To burn cloth was to burn shame, and to stand in its smoke was to reclaim innocence. They believed that what fire touched became holy. But the ritual had its dangers. The fumes were thick, the heat uneven. Some fainted from lack of air. Others suffered burns when the bowls flared suddenly. A few households caught fire entirely, though these incidents were whispered about rather than written down. To admit the risk was to admit foolishness, and pride rarely allowed that. The women continued, convinced that the discomfort was simply part of the process. Beauty and pain had long been companions in their world. Over time, the ashes became a new tool of care. They mixed the powder with oil or animal fat to create a grey paste, which they rubbed on their skin as a seal against odour. The paste left stains on linen and a faint smell of smoke wherever they went. Still, it was considered progress. To smell of ashes was better than to smell of sweat. The illusion of purity mattered more than comfort. I find it quietly haunting that their notion of cleanliness depended on destroying the very fabric meant to cover them. The air inside these rooms never fully cleared. Days later, the faint odour of burnt fabric lingered in corners, trapped in curtains and hair. The women grew used to it, carrying the scent wherever they went, mistaking familiarity for success. To them, it was proof that they were cared for, that their bodies were maintained according to the best knowledge of their time. In the stillness after each ritual, the ashes cooled and darkened, symbols of a strange victory over dirt. The bowl was cleaned, the floor swept, and life went on as if nothing had happened. But the scent remained, weaving itself into their daily existence like a quiet reminder of the lengths they went to for purity. They sat in the smoke and called it sanctity. They gathered ashes and called them perfume. What they could not cleanse with water, they offered to fire, never realizing the price it took in return. They wore layers of fabric so heavy that even the simplest act of the body had no escape. Beneath the folds of linen and wool, the air grew warm, the skin damp, and the cloth absorbed what it could. The dresses were thick, made to guard modesty and shape, but they also trapped everything that touched them. When nature called, there was no undressing, no privacy, only a careful shift of fabric and quiet acceptance. The liquid spread through the layers, slowed by petticoats and undergarments, until it stopped, hidden from sight. They straightened their posture, let the fabric fall back into place, and walked on as if nothing had happened. The dampness cooled quickly in the air. By nightfall, the dress was dry again, stiff in places, marked faintly with pale traces of salt. To them, this was simply part of life. A woman's dress was not easily removed, and many wore it from dawn until sleep. Washing such heavy garments was nearly impossible. Water had to be carried